Chapter 1. Abandoned by her own. Bridget's steps were shaky, each footfall a reminder of the weight she carried, not just the life growing inside her, but the heavy burden of rejection. She had always been strong, confident in her role as the pack's healer. She had given everything to her people, spent sleepless nights tending to the sick and wounded, and used every ounce of her power to protect them. But now, when it was her turn to need help, they had cast her aside like a forgotten relic. Her alpha air mate, the man she had loved for as long as she could remember, had rejected her. He said she was broken, that she was no longer the woman he had once been drawn to. And now, pregnant with the child of a rogue, she was deemed unworthy. Bridget could barely comprehend how her life had spiraled so violently in a matter of days. They had thrown her out, left her to die alone in the woods, abandoned as she carried a child that was not from their pack. The child inside her was a rogue's, a man she barely knew, but the bond between them was undeniable. The forest around her was dense and unforgiving. The trees loomed overhead, their thick branches like dark fingers, suffocating the sky. Her body felt heavy, and with each step, her vision blurred. She stumbled, feeling the familiar ache of hunger and exhaustion gnaw at her, and finally collapsed beside a tree. She couldn't go on. Not anymore. Chapter 2. The Lycan King. It was the scent that first reached Brian, the Lycan King. Strong, wild, and intoxicating. He was never one to follow a trail for no reason, but something about it beckoned him. Brian had long ago hardened his heart, sworn off the idea of finding his fated mate. But the bond, the pull, was undeniable. He followed the scent until he found her, Bridget, her body frail and lifeless, sprawled beneath the shade of a tree. Her once radiant skin now pale, her breath shallow and labored. At the sight of her, his heart, a heart that he thought had turned to stone long ago, hammered in his chest. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. Her body smelled of desperation, of a soul crushed by betrayal, and yet, even in her broken state, she held a power that tugged at his own wolf, begging to be claimed. Brian knelt beside her, his large frame shadowing her small, trembling form. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, a jolt of heat shot through him, and the bond slammed into place. She was his. He knew it, and so did she. "You carry my pup," he growled softly, his voice thick with emotion. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her gaze. "Who are you?" she whispered weakly. "I am your mate," he answered, voice full of certainty. "And you are mine." Chapter 3. Claiming the mate. Bridget's mind swirled. She was barely clinging to life, rejected by her pack, abandoned to die. And now, a man she didn't know was claiming to be her fated mate? It was too much. It couldn't be real. "No," she spat, her voice shaky but defiant. "I don't need your protection. I don't need anyone." Brian's wolf seethed within him, growling with possessive fury. He had waited his entire life for his mate, and he was not going to let her go so easily. But he understood her anger. She had been wronged by her pack, and now, she was reluctant to accept the truth. "You are mine, whether you accept it or not," he said firmly, his voice rough. "And you'll be safe now. I'll protect you." But Bridget pulled away from him, her exhaustion turning into fierce resistance. She wasn't going to let him tie her down, especially not after what her own people had done to her. She had never needed anyone to protect her before, and she wasn't about to start now. "I don't belong to you," she whispered fiercely. Brian felt a twinge of pain in his chest, but he wouldn't let it show. Instead, he leaned down and gently lifted her into his arms. "You will. But first, you need rest." Chapter 4. The struggle between desire and defiance. The journey to Brian's stronghold was silent except for the sound of Bridget's breathing, shallow but steady now. The palace was a far cry from the wilderness she had grown accustomed to. It was grand, elegant, with walls of stone that seemed to echo centuries of Lycan history. She was a far cry from the proud woman she once was. Now she was fragile, caught between longing and resistance, between the desire to fall into his embrace and the fear of what that might mean. Brian did everything in his power to make her comfortable, to show her she was safe. But the more he did, the more she resisted. Her stubbornness didn't make it easier. It only made him want her more. He found her late at night, staring out of the massive windows, looking out at the moon with a sense of longing. "I know you don't want this," he said softly, his voice laced with sorrow. "But it's our fate, and I will not abandon you like they did." She turned to him, her face hard but her eyes searching, as if trying to see the truth in his words. But it wasn't easy. Every part of her rebelled against this fate. "I won't be your prisoner," she whispered, though the desire for him was clear in her eyes. Brian approached her slowly, as if not wanting to spook her. He didn't have the words to reassure her fully, but he had his actions. His kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, but soon it deepened, igniting a fire inside both of them. He pulled back slowly, his breath ragged. "I will never force you," he said softly, his forehead against hers. "But you are mine, Bridget, and I will fight for you." Chapter 5. The darkness approaches. The days that followed were filled with tension. Bridget's resistance began to wear thin, but her heart was still a fortress. She had been betrayed by everyone she ever trusted. And now, here was a man, a powerful, fearsome king, who was asking for her trust. But it wasn't just her heart that was under attack. News had already spread that Bridget, the rejected healer, was carrying the Lycan King's pup. And there were those in the pack who would stop at nothing to bring her down. Betrayal was on the wind, and soon, the enemies that had been lurking in the shadows came to light. One night, as Bridget sat in her chambers, she sensed something in the air, a coldness, an undercurrent of danger. Before she could react, a group of hunters stormed into the room, their eyes fixed on her. Brian's wolf howled in fury as he tore into the room, his form shifting from man to beast in an instant. The battle that ensued was brutal, and though the hunters were fierce, Brian was stronger. But in the chaos, something inside Bridget began to shift. Her wolf, the one she had buried for so long, stirred awake. Chapter 6. Awakening the Wolf. Bridget's body trembled as the bond between her and Brian pulsed stronger, the full force of the bond finally hitting her. Her senses were sharper, her mind clearer, and the fire in her veins was undeniable. She had spent so long trying to suppress her wolf, thinking it was something to fear. But now, it was her strength. Her hands shook as she stood and faced the enemies that had come for her. She wasn't going to cower anymore. She wasn't going to be the broken healer they had cast aside. She was a Lycan, a powerful creature with the strength to protect her family. "I will not let you take me," Bridget growled, her voice low and dangerous. With the power of her wolf fully awakened, Bridget took control of the fight. Her instincts kicked in, and soon, the hunters who had come to kill her were running for their lives. Brian watched, stunned, as Bridget's power fully unleashed. "You're incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. Bridget turned to him, her heart racing. She had never felt more alive, more powerful. She had found her strength, and with it, she would fight for the future of her pup, and for the love that had once seemed so impossible. Chapter 7. Love and Destiny. In the aftermath of the battle, as the pack began to accept her strength, Bridget found herself softening toward Brian. The wall she had built around her heart began to crumble, and the love she had denied blossomed in her chest. But she wasn't just a woman who had been claimed. She was a force, a protector, a mother. And with Brian, her mate, they would face whatever came next, together. Their love, built on trust and fate, had survived rejection, betrayal, and darkness. Now, it would lead them into a future that had once seemed impossible, but one that was now within their grasp. And as the moon shone brightly in the night sky, Bridget held Brian's hand, knowing that together, they would rule the future, with their pup in their arms and their love forever entwined. Chapter 8. Embracing the Bond. Bridget sat by the fire that crackled in the grand hearth of Brian's palace, the warmth of the flames contrasting sharply with the chill that still gripped her heart. She had fought so long to keep her distance from Brian, to resist the pull of their bond, but each passing day made it more difficult. Her body longed for his touch, and the more she tried to deny it, the more her wolf responded to him. But love was never simple for her. She had been cast aside by those who were supposed to care for her, and now, a king, a powerful, fearsome ruler, wanted her. It didn't make sense. She didn't know how to fit into his world, a world that seemed so different from her own. She wasn't sure she belonged here, in this world of luxury and power, when she had been nothing but an outcast before. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. She looked up, her heart quickening as Brian entered the room. His presence filled the space, and for a moment, she felt the weight of his gaze on her. His eyes were soft, full of something she couldn't quite place, something that made her pulse race. He came to stand beside her, his towering form casting a shadow over her small, fragile body. Without a word, he sat down next to her, the warmth of his body close enough to make her skin tingle. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, his voice low, as if the words were meant only for her. Bridget stiffened, her heart hammering. She didn't want to admit it, but his words struck a chord deep inside her. She had spent so long running from the truth, from the idea that she was meant to be with him. But now, sitting beside him, she felt the undeniable truth of their connection, a connection that could not be broken. She turned to him, her eyes locking with his. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice shaky, betraying the fear she still carried within her. "Then what are you afraid of?" Brian asked, his gaze softening. His hand reached out, gently cupping her face, his touch sending a shockwave through her body. Bridget didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch, the steady rhythm of his breath. She wasn't afraid of him. No, she was afraid of herself. Of the way he made her feel, of how she couldn't control the longing that burned inside her. "I'm afraid of trusting you," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian's hand caressed her cheek, and for a moment, the world felt still. "I would never hurt you, Bridget. You are my mate. And I'll protect you, no matter what." The raw honesty in his words cut through her defenses. Slowly, her walls began to crumble, piece by piece, until she was left exposed. She was tired of fighting, tired of running. And so, without another word, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel safe. Chapter 9. The Threat Within. But even as Bridget allowed herself to finally trust Brian, trouble was brewing within the walls of the palace. The pack that had once rejected her was not so easily forgotten, and not all Lycans were pleased with the way things were unfolding. There were whispers in the shadows, eyes watching every move. Bridget knew that the peace they had achieved was fragile, a delicate balance that could shatter at any moment. One evening, as she walked through the palace gardens, her senses heightened, Bridget felt it, a shift in the air. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she heard the faintest rustle in the bushes behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, only to find nothing but shadows. But she knew. She could feel it. She was being watched. The thought of it sent a cold chill down her spine. She wasn't just a target anymore. She was Brian's mate, and with that came a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. She had to protect her pup, protect herself. Bridget's thoughts were interrupted as a familiar voice reached her ears. "Bridget." She turned to see Brian approaching, his expression dark. "What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes searching her face for any sign of distress. "I can feel it," she said, her voice tight. "Someone is watching us." Brian's eyes narrowed, his wolf stirring beneath the surface. "Then we'll find them," he said with a quiet determination. "You are under my protection, and I'll make sure no one harms you or our pup." Chapter 10. A Betrayal Unfolds. Days passed in tense silence. Bridget tried to shake the feeling that something was amiss, but the weight of it never left her. Then, one fateful night, her worst fears came true. She had been asleep in her chambers when she heard a noise. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, came from the hallway outside her door. Before she could react, the door to her room was thrown open, and she was greeted by the sight of a familiar face, one she had not expected to see in the palace. It was Lycan, the alpha heir who had once been her mate. His eyes were filled with something dark, something that made Bridget's stomach twist in disgust. "You," she hissed, pushing herself up from the bed. "What are you doing here?" Rylan stepped into the room, his posture arrogant and cold. "I've come to finish what I started," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Bridget's heart sank. She had known there were factions within the pack that resented her, but she had never imagined that Rylan would be involved. "You're a traitor," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "You cast me aside, and now you come to finish me off?" Rylan's lips curled into a sneer. "You were never meant to be with Brian. You were always meant to be mine. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you understand that." Before Bridget could react, he lunged at her, but Brian was there in an instant, his presence a wall between them. "Leave her," Brian growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You've made a grave mistake coming here." Rylan smirked, clearly unfazed. "I'm not afraid of you, Brian. You may be the king, but you can't protect her forever." Brian's eyes flashed with fury as he stepped forward, his muscles rippling with the power of his wolf. "Get out," he commanded, his voice filled with an authority that brooked no argument. Rylan hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and fear. With a final hateful glance at Bridget, he turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Bridget stood frozen, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. But Brian was there beside her in an instant, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "I won't let him hurt you," Brian said softly, his voice filled with a vow. Bridget buried her face in his chest, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. She was no longer just a healer. She was the Lycan King's mate, and with that came a responsibility to protect not only herself but the future they would build together. Chapter 11. An Unexpected Alliance. The threat from Rylan was not the only danger lurking in the shadows. As word of Bridget's connection to the Lycan King spread, a new enemy emerged, one that was far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. A faction of rogue Lycans, determined to undermine Brian's rule, began to plot against him. They saw Bridget as a threat to their power and knew that if they could eliminate her, they could weaken Brian's reign. Brian, ever the strategist, began to prepare for war. But he wasn't alone. Bridget, now fully awake to the power of her wolf, was ready to fight beside him. They formed an unlikely alliance with a group of outcasts, those who had been abandoned by the pack like Bridget. Together, they would take on the rogues and protect their future, but they knew the road ahead would not be easy. Chapter 12. Battle for the Future. The time had come. Bridget and Brian stood side by side, ready to face the enemy that threatened everything they had built. The battle would be brutal, and not everyone would make it out alive. But Bridget's heart was steady, her resolve unshaken. She had come into her own, accepting the woman she was meant to be, and with Brian at her side, there was nothing they couldn't conquer. As the battle raged on, Bridget fought with a strength she had never known she had. Her wolf, fully awakened, moved in perfect harmony with Brian's, their power united as one. And when the dust finally settled, Bridget knew that their love, their destiny, had been sealed. Chapter 13. The Unbreakable Bond. In the aftermath of the battle, as the remnants of the rogue faction were cleared away, Bridget and Brian stood victorious. The future was uncertain, but one thing was certain: they were stronger than ever. Their bond, once a fragile thread, had been tested by fire and forged into something unbreakable. They were fated mates, and nothing would ever tear them apart. Together they would rule, not just as king and queen, but as equals, united by their love and their shared strength. And as Bridget looked down at her growing belly, she knew that the future she had once feared was now a future she could embrace. Chapter 14. The Calm Before the Storm. For the first time in months, there was peace in the palace. The heavy weight of betrayal, violence, and fear had lifted, replaced by the quiet hum of everyday life. Bridget could almost believe that the worst was behind them. Almost. She spent her days in the palace's gardens, her once heavy heart now lighter, but still cautious. The danger that had stalked her, that had almost torn her world apart, still lingered in the back of her mind. She knew better than to think that their enemies had disappeared. No, the Lycan world was a treacherous place, and it wasn't easy to take a throne, especially when you were surrounded by those who wanted to tear it down. Still, she allowed herself moments of normalcy. Moments of peace. She worked on strengthening the bond between her and Brian, building a life where she no longer felt like an outcast, where she no longer felt like the broken healer. Now, with the strength of her wolf awakening, she was more than that. The palace, once cold and intimidating, now felt like home. Her home. And in this new world she had built with Brian, their love, though hard one, was everything. The shared looks, the whispered words of affection, the tenderness that passed between them whenever they were together, it was all proof of the deep connection they shared. Brian was no longer just the king to her. He was her equal, her protector, her heart. But peace, it seemed, was fleeting. Bridget could feel it in the air, that tension that hung just beneath the surface, a storm that was gathering. Chapter 15. A King's Dilemma. Brian sat in the war room, his gaze fixed on the map before him. His mind was elsewhere, troubled by thoughts of the future. The war against the rogue Lycans had not yet ended. While many of their enemies had been dealt with, there were still pockets of resistance. They had scattered like rats, regrouping, biding their time. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And Bridget, his mate, the mother of his pup, was still a target. Brian's wolf was growing restless. Every time he saw her, felt her presence, his animal side seethed with possessive fury. He wanted to keep her hidden, keep her safe. But he knew better than anyone that safety was an illusion. They were both powerful, and the forces that sought to tear them apart would stop at nothing. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was Nathaniel, his trusted general and close friend. "My king," Nathaniel said, bowing low before sitting across from Brian, "the rogues are amassing on the outskirts. They're not making any moves yet, but we believe they are waiting for the right moment. And we still have traitors in the pack." Brian's jaw tightened. "I'll never stop fighting for her," he said, his voice filled with a dark promise. His thoughts immediately turned to Bridget. She wasn't just a queen, she was his destiny. Nathaniel studied his friend carefully. "You've already put a target on yourself by taking her in. But we won't let them take you down, Brian. Not now. Not ever." "I know," Brian muttered, "but I'm worried about Bridget. I need her safe. I can't lose her." The bond they shared was stronger than either of them could have anticipated, and Brian knew, deep down, that the only way to protect Bridget was to finally end this war. For good. Chapter 16. A Love Tested. Days turned into weeks, and Bridget's fear of the unknown slowly gave way to determination. She had learned to trust Brian, and in doing so, had learned to trust herself. She could be more than just the abandoned healer. She could be a queen, a warrior, a protector. And, perhaps most importantly, she could be the mate her king needed. But as the days wore on, Brian's presence grew more distant. He became consumed by the war, his thoughts always focused on what lay ahead. Their time together grew fewer and farther between, and Bridget felt the familiar sting of loneliness creeping back into her heart. The woman who had once been so self-sufficient now found herself yearning for the warmth of his embrace, the closeness they had shared when their love had first ignited. She needed him. But more than that, she needed to know that they were in this together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the palace gardens, Bridget sought out Brian. She found him on the balcony overlooking the land, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Brian," she said softly, stepping closer to him. He turned to her, his eyes dark with worry, but when he saw her, his face softened. "Bridget, I didn't want to burden you with this. I'm not burdened, she said, taking a step forward, her voice gentle but firm. You've carried the weight of your kingdom for so long. But you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore. Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to drag you into this. The enemies we face are ruthless. They want everything. They want you. Then let them come, Bridget replied, her voice unwavering. I've been running for too long. I'm not going to hide anymore. I've found my strength. I've found my purpose, with you. Her words struck a chord deep inside him. Brian had always seen her as strong, but now, standing before him, she had become even more than that. She was his equal, his partner, the mother of his child, and his destiny. And as he took her in his arms, he finally realized that there was nothing more he wanted than to build a life with her, not just as a king and queen, but as two people bound by love and the promise of a future that was theirs to claim. Chapter 17. The Battle Unleashed. The time for talk was over. Brian and Bridget knew that the threat of the rogue Lycans couldn't be ignored any longer. The future of their kingdom, and their pup's future, depended on it. The final battle would be brutal, and Bridget was ready. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned by her pack. She was stronger now, not just because of the bond she shared with Brian, but because she had awakened the power that had always been within her. With the alliance of the outcasts, they gathered their forces, preparing for the war that would decide everything. Bridget stood alongside Brian, her eyes filled with determination, her heart filled with love for the king she had come to cherish. The battlefield stretched out before them, the ground scarred from past wars. The air was thick with tension as both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. Bridget's senses were heightened, her wolf restless, and with a single look from Brian, they knew what had to be done. The battle raged on. The sound of swords clashing, the howl of wolves, the growls of the Lycan kings and queens fighting for their lives filled the air. It was chaos, but through the haze of violence, Bridget fought with everything she had. She had her wolf, and she would use it to protect everything she loved. The war was won, not by strength alone, but by the unyielding bond between them. And in the end, when the dust settled, it was not just Brian's kingdom that was saved, but their future. Together, they had triumphed over the forces that had sought to destroy them. Chapter 18. A Future Unwritten. With the battle behind them, Brian and Bridget stood together on the balcony once again, watching as the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon. The world had changed, and so had they. Their bond, once frail and uncertain, was now unbreakable. The love they shared was stronger than anything they had ever imagined. They had fought for their future, and now they would live it, together. Bridget's hand rested on her swollen belly, and a smile tugged at her lips. We did it, she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. Brian's arms slid around her waist, pulling her close. No, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. We did it together. And as they stood there, watching the sun rise on a new day, they knew that their future, and the future of their child, would be one of strength, love, and destiny. Together, they had claimed it. Together, they would rule. And nothing, not betrayal, not enemies, not even the world itself, would ever tear them apart. The end.